Okay, so you're here with us because you really want to understand what's going on in the world,
Mm,
and you want to do it without getting lost in all the noise, all the extra stuff.
right, exactly.
So today we're going to take a really close look at this proposed resource deal between the U.S. and Ukraine.
Yeah.
Um, and what's really interesting about this is that people are comparing it to how the U.S. and Saudi Arabia have worked together over oil historically.
Right.
So our goal today is really simple. We're going to lay out all the key parts of this proposed U.S.-Ukraine agreement, and we're also going to look at what we can learn from that U.S.-Saudi Arabia situation.
Yeah, makes sense.
And of course, we're going to do all of this by sticking to the facts.
Absolutely.
So from what we're seeing, what's being reported, there's a draft agreement going around, right? And it involves all these Ukrainian mineral resources.
That's right. And it's important to point out that we're not just talking about a few specific minerals here. The reports indicate that this agreement would cover all of Ukraine's mineral wealth, including oil and gas, which are pretty significant.
So I'm talking about a sweeping agreement then, right? Like everything under the ground in Ukraine.
Yeah, pretty much.
Okay, so if that's the scope, then how are they talking about managing all the money that comes from these resources?
Well, the draft agreement lays out a plan to set up an investment fund.
Okay.
This fund would handle all the financial stuff, and it would be managed by 5 individuals.
5 people for all of that.
And here's the kicker. 3 of those representatives would be from the U.S., and they would have veto power over any decisions made by the fund.
Hold on. 3 out of 5, and they have veto power.
That's right.
So the U.S. has a lot of control over how this fund is run.
It looks that way, yeah.
Okay, so let's say the resources are extracted. They make money. Where does all that money go?
Well, the proposal says that all the funds generated would first be converted into currency and then moved out of Ukraine.
Out of Ukraine.
Yeah. This movement of money abroad, that's a really key part of this whole arrangement.
So just to be clear, the resources are taken out the ground, they make money, and then that money is sent to another country.
Basically, yes.
Okay, so how are they planning on actually getting those resources out of the ground in the first place?
The proposed method is joint extraction.
Joint extraction.
Yeah. So both state-owned Ukrainian companies and private companies would work together to get all those different resources out.
Right, because we said it's not just one type of resource, it's everything.
Exactly. It's a massive undertaking.
Okay, so we have extraction happening, but then where does all the income from that go? We talk about an investment fund, right?
Yes, you got it. Ukraine would be obligated to take all the income they make from their mineral resources and put it directly into that investment fund.
The one with U.S. representatives and the veto power.
That's the one.
Got it. Yeah. Okay, so what's the U.S. putting into this deal? It can't just be about getting access to all these resources, right?
Well, the way it's being presented, the U.S. contribution is all the military aid that they've given to Ukraine since February of 2022.
So they're basically saying, we've already given you all this help, and that counts as our part of the deal.
It seems that way, yeah.
Okay, then, what about the profits and royalties from this whole thing? How would they be split up between the U.S. and Ukraine?
That's a big one. Based on the information we have, it looks like the U.S. would be able to decide how and when they profit from the fund.
So they have control over that.
It appears so. And on top of that, the U.S. would also be the first to receive any royalties generated by the fund.
Ukraine wouldn't get anything until after the U.S. takes their share.
That's what the draft agreement says.
So the U.S. gets to decide their own profits, and they get the first cut of the royalties. That's a pretty big deal.
Definitely sets up a specific power dynamic, doesn't it?
Okay, so how long is this agreement supposed to last? Is there an end date?
Well, this is where it gets even more interesting. The draft agreement proposes that it should be perpetual.
Perpetual. So it just goes on forever.
Unless changes are made, but here's the catch. Any changes or even the termination of the agreement would need approval from Washington.
So the U.S. essentially has the final say on if it continues and how it changes.
That's how it's written, yes.
So it's perpetual. The U.S. has to approve any changes, and we know Ukraine really needs help with security. Does this agreement provide any of that?
That's what's really surprising. This draft agreement reportedly doesn't mention security guarantees for Ukraine at all.
Wait a minute. An agreement about a country's most valuable resources?
Yeah.
And it doesn't say anything about protecting that country.
A lot of people are pointing that out. Yeah, it does seem like a pretty big omission.
It does. So is this a done deal, or what's the status?
Not at all. It's really important to understand that this is just a draft. It's not final. There's a lot of expectation that Ukraine is going to push for some big changes to what's been proposed.
So they're not just going to accept this as is.
No, it doesn't sound like it. In fact, President Zelensky has said publicly that he's gotten a new version of the agreement and he's going to review it very carefully before even thinking about sending it to their parliament for approval.
That makes sense. So it's still very much in the negotiation phase.
Absolutely.
And I think there was talk about this possibly being signed earlier this year, right?
Yeah, there was some expectation that a version of this agreement might be signed around February 28th.
Great.
But that didn't happen.
So something caused a delay.
Apparently there were disagreements and things stalled, but the negotiations have been going on since early February, so this has been in the works for a while.
Okay, so we've got a pretty good picture of this proposed deal now, right?
Right.
But let's switch gears and talk about that historical comparison with the U.S. and Saudi Arabia, the whole oil for security thing.
Right.
Why are people bringing that up now?
Well, the Wall Street Journal specifically called it a poignant historical precedent when they were analyzing this U.S.-Ukraine resource deal.
Interesting. So what exactly was this oil for security deal?
It was an understanding between the U.S. and Saudi Arabia that lasted for decades, although it was never officially written down.
An unofficial agreement for decades.
Right. And it basically said that Saudi Arabia's security was tied to American oil companies being there and extracting oil after World War II.
So American oil interests and the safety of Saudi Arabia became very closely linked.
Exactly. And that relationship, it continued even after Saudi Arabia nationalized its energy industry back in 1980.
So even when Saudi Arabia took control of its own oil, the basic connection between the U.S. and Saudi Arabia stayed strong.
Right, and we saw a big example of that in 1990 when Iraq invaded Kuwait. The U.S. actually sent almost 500,000 troops to defend Saudi Arabia.
Wow, 500,000 troops. That shows how serious they were about protecting Saudi Arabia.
It does, but things have changed since then, haven't they?
It seems like Saudi Arabia's perspective on this relationship has shifted, right?
They have. They've started to feel like even though the U.S. has helped them militarily, that hasn't always meant their economic interests were protected in every situation.
So they started looking for stronger, more concrete security guarantees.
Exactly.
And there was a specific event that really highlighted this wasn't there.
Yeah, the Wall Street Journal talked about a missile attack in 2019 that was supposedly carried out by Iran. It hit a major Saudi oil facility.
And that did a lot of damage to their oil production, right?
It did, but the U.S. didn't respond militarily.
So that must have sent a pretty clear message to Saudi Arabia.
It did. It made them really unsure about whether the U.S. would actually protect them when they needed it.
They felt let down.
You could say that, and because of that, they started looking at other options for security partnerships, specifically with Russia and China.
So they felt like they needed to find more reliable allies.
That's the impression we get.
And at the same time, the U.S. perspective on the region was also changing, right?
Right. During the Cold War, the U.S. saw the Persian Gulf as this absolutely crucial strategic asset. That was back in 1990.
Right. But by 2019, things were different.
The U.S. wasn't as reliant on oil from the Middle East anymore. They were producing more oil themselves, and there were all these regional conflicts that made things unstable.
So their priorities changed, and their need for Middle Eastern oil wasn't as strong. That makes sense.
Yeah.
I mean, things change, right? So now we have this proposed U.S.-Ukraine deal, and we have this history between the U.S. and Saudi Arabia. What are the big differences people are talking about, and what are the warnings coming out of that?
There are some really important distinctions and potential challenges for Ukraine. The first one is that the U.S. and Saudi Arabia had decades of really deep ties. Their oil sectors and militaries were very intertwined long before anything was officially formalized.
They had a long history of working together.
Ukraine doesn't have that same kind of close relationship with the U.S.
Right, so that deep connection that was a big part of the U.S.-Saudi relationship.
And then there's the issue of the war in Ukraine.
Obviously a huge factor.
A big portion of Ukraine's mineral resources are currently under Russian control.
That's a major problem.
Makes it really difficult and risky for foreign companies to invest and actually develop those resources.
Absolutely. Just getting access to those resources is a huge obstacle.
And even if they could get access, it's not like it would be an immediate economic win for investors.
Yeah. Right, because it takes time to get these projects up and running.
It would probably take years for U.S. companies to even begin operations if they decided to invest.
And there's no guarantee that it would be profitable.
Exactly, especially with all the risks and instability in the region.
So it's a much less certain investment compared to Saudi Arabia's established and very productive oil industry.
You could say that.
And how does all of this affect the idea of the U.S. providing security guarantees to Ukraine, especially if those guarantees are tied to this resource deal?
That's the big question. All these factors, the lack of deep ties, the ongoing war, the uncertainty about profitability, they could all weaken any security commitments from the U.S.
Because if there's no strong or reliable economic incentive for the U.S., then their commitment to Ukraine's security might also be less strong and less reliable.
That's the concern.
And there was an expert from the Middle East Institute, Greg Gause, who talked about this, right?
He did. He said that the argument that Ukraine can count on the U.S. protecting them because of American interest in their rare earth elements, that's a weak link in their overall security strategy.
So he's basically saying don't rely on that.
He's saying be careful and look at what happened with Saudi Arabia.
Because even though the U.S. was committed to Saudi Arabia for a long time, that commitment changed as the U.S.'s strategic priorities and economic needs changed.
Exactly.
So to recap, we've got this proposed U.S.-Ukraine resource deal, which covers all of Ukraine's minerals, gives a lot of control and potential benefits to the U.S., and uses past military aid as the U.S. contribution. And we've got this historical example of the U.S.-Saudi Arabia oil for security arrangement, which was a long-standing relationship, but even that changed over time.
Yeah.
And the big takeaway here is that Ukraine needs to be cautious. There are a lot of differences between their situation and Saudi Arabia's.
That's a great summary.
Ukraine doesn't have those deep historical ties with the U.S. The war is a major obstacle to developing their resources, and there's no guarantee that any of this will be profitable for the U.S. So any implied security assurances from the U.S. based on this deal, well, they might not be as reliable as Ukraine hopes.
The situation is complex, for sure.
It is, and it highlights how U.S. security commitments can change based on all sorts of factors.
It's a dynamic situation with a lot of moving parts.
Well, thanks for breaking all of this down. It's been really helpful.
Happy to do it.
Subscribe to our podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and YouTube. We are here to make things clear. New episodes every day.